Okay. Okay. How's everyone doing today? Great. Well, we're very happy to have you all in here today. For those of you who are regular viewers in person for us in our lectures, I'm taking over for Lori Meads today. I'm Andrew Nelson Redondo, and I am the exhibition designer for the Museum of the Albemarle, and it's a pleasure to be your host today. For those of you who are virtually attending, I kindly ask that you all please mute your audio. That way you don't get picked up. For questions and answers, that will probably be done at the very end of the lecture. And before we begin, we'll just do a couple little brief introductions or reminders about some of the upcoming events that we have today. All right, so for our next History for Lunch, this will be scheduled on Wednesday, November 3rd at 12 p.m. And this will be with Rear Admiral Carlson Moore. And he'll be joining us virtually all the way from California to discuss a daring rescue that on December 17th of 2000, the Coast Guard Air Station, Elizabeth City, North Carolina, responded to the call for help. The cruise ship Seabreeze 1 was listing, battered by hurricane force winds and 35-foot seas. The ship and the lives of its 34 crewmen were in imminent peril. A rescue helicopter arrived, and seeing that the vessel could capsize at any moment, hoisted 26 of the crew to safety, a record for a single helicopter rescue. A second helicopter designed for the celebration of the Wright brothers' first flight arrived on scene in time to rescue the remaining crew. This lecture will be again on November 3rd at 12 p.m. Right, and just to introduce Melissa Stuckey before she begins her lecture. Melissa Stuckey is the Assistant Professor of African American History at Elizabeth City State University here in North Carolina in Elizabeth City. She's a specialist in early 20th century Black activism. She is the author of several magazine and journal articles, including Boli, Indian Territory, Exercising Freedom in All Black Town, published in 2017 in the Journal of African American History. Stuckey is currently completing her first book entitled All Men Up, Seeking Freedom in the All-Black Town of Boli, Oklahoma, which interrogates the Black freedom struggle in Oklahoma as it took shape in the state's largest all-Black town. Committed to engaging the public in important conversations about African American history, Stuckey has been awarded major grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, and the National Park Service to rehabilitate a historic Rosenwald School building on ECSU's campus and support the exploration of ways to preserve northeastern North Carolina's Rosenwald School history. Stuckey is also a contributing historian to the NEH-funded Free and Equal Project in Beaufort, South Carolina. She will interpret the story of Reconstruction for a national and international audience and senior historical consultant to the Coltrane Group, a nonprofit organization in Oklahoma committed to helping these towns survive in the 21st century. She's earned her bachelor's degree from Princeton University with a PhD from Yale University. Thank you, and I hope you all enjoy yourselves with this lecture today called Beyond the Green Book, using a project-based learning to recover African American history in Elizabeth City. Go ahead, Ms. Melissa.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much to the Museum of the Albemarle for inviting me to talk a little bit about a project that is a works in progress, something that I am working on in the classroom with my students. And I've been doing that for the past year. And also whenever I can just steal a little bit of time away from some of the other projects that you heard that I talk about or that I work on. My professional interests have always been in post-Civil War African American communities. And I started my first sort of major research project, which resulted in my dissertation and some publications about all Black towns in Oklahoma. And since coming to ECSU in 2017, I have been privileged to think about African-American communities within the American South and within a city where African-American people are or have been either a large portion of the population or sometimes a majority, and one that has a historically Black university and a very long history from the colonial period through today of African-American populations. So it's a real privilege to be able to work here and to think about the environment in which I live and work now as a place of study. So that is where I come in terms of placing myself into this work. Every day, I make a commute from the northern part of town on North 17 to Elizabeth City State University. And the drive that I make will be very familiar to those of you who live in Elizabeth City, driving down 17, which is also known as Road Street, and winding my way through Road Street as it makes twists and turns, crossing Main Street and Colonial Street and Main Street and Grice and then Airing House. And then into the Shepherd Street neighborhood, where it then crosses Shepherd and Speed and Pear Tree and Roanoke, all the way to Weeksville Road and turning onto Weeksville Road to get to my job. I make that drive. I've made that drive every day, just about for the past 4 years, with the exception of 2020, when I worked from home primarily. And it's always fascinated me from the very first day that I came to Elizabeth City for my job interview in the spring of 2017. It fascinated me because I love old neighborhoods, and I have a real eye for imagining what older neighborhoods looked like a century ago, when they were not old, but instead were kind of at their prime in terms of newness, of construction, and maybe a time when the city's wealth looked differently, right? So I see tin roofs, I see very ornate porch trimming, but I also see many empty lots and buildings that are no longer in use. And it is, these spaces really spark my imagination. What would this place have looked like making the same commute 100 years ago? What would have been in those empty lots, whether they are covered in grass or whether they're paved over? What buildings would have been there instead of some of the newer retail buildings like the CVS or the gas stations that line Airing House Road and Road Street, that big intersection? What would have been placed in those places that are now empty parking lots, right? So I have all of these questions, even as I'm also, looking with wide eyes, as much as I can, while safely driving at some of the houses and buildings that still do stand, that maybe have different use than they did before, or maybe they're vacant and boarded up, or maybe they just have had some wear and tear from the years. So I look at all of these things every day, and I just want to know the stories. And that is how I became immersed in doing small history projects that hopefully will lead to something larger, to learn more about my environment, our shared environment in Elizabeth City, to learn more about the landscape as it has changed over time, to learn about the people, and to really kind of immerse myself into our shared living space. So the very first little piece that I ever wrote and published about these explorations was about the Albemarle Bank. And I believe this was published in 2019 in the Daily Advance. And it just shares the story of this former Albemarle Bank building, which is located on South Poindexter and Fearing Street in downtown Elizabeth City. And at the time that the bank was established in 1920, it was a huge deal. First, because it is an African-American owned bank, and those are very rare. As I mentioned, I write about an all-Black town in Oklahoma that had a total of 3 African-American owned banks over different periods of time, but that is not typical. There are certain areas that become banking centers. So African-American banking centers. So for example, the Durham, Raleigh-Durham area had African-American owned bank. But the fact that there was one in Elizabeth City really does indicate the importance of Elizabeth City as a financial space for not just Pasquotank County, but the other counties surrounding this area in terms of African-American people and African-American prosperity. This bank was very short-lived, and I honestly, when I stumbled upon it, I was really surprised to discover that it existed. Obviously, there are some folks who are going to know, yes, of course, there was an Albemarle Bank, but I don't think it was common knowledge. And certainly in terms of the way that history has been told and shared in Elizabeth City, that story has not been well preserved. So part of the importance of doing history as a historian is making sure that there's a written record that talks about what was, and that we don't lose the living memory of these kinds of things. So this Albemarle Bank building, like I said, was very short-lived. It housed other banks, and then it's now housed several different kinds of retail establishments. Beautiful building located here on Fearing and Poindexter. And I'll just note that as I've started to do this work with my students, I've started to observe that there's a footprint of the African-American neighborhood that is traditionally understood to be Shepherd and Road Street in terms of its historic value that crosses onto Ehringhaus, and there are crosses to the other side of Ehringhaus. And this bank in a lot of ways can be seen as an anchor. So what I mean by that is if you were to walk down Poindexter or Fearing 100 years ago, this would not be the only African-American owned business on those streets. So moving forward, I was aware of and had been in communication with the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission starting in around 2018 when they began their research project called Oasis Spaces. And this project was about the North Carolina Green Book businesses. And it was inspired by the Negro Motorist Green Book, which was established in 1936 and was printed from 1936 to 1966 by Victor H. Green, a New York postal worker who realized as he traveled south to visit family members the importance of having access as African-American people to reliable access to hotels and restaurants and clubs and barbershops and all kinds of other amenities as one traveled through the landscape during the era of segregation. As we know, during the era of segregation, there were many places that did not welcome African-American patrons at all and made that very clear through signage. And then there were others who discriminated against them, which was very legal, so that they would have to enter a restaurant through the kitchen or just get food from the kitchen to eat outside. And there was the ability to get overnight accommodations was not reliable. You couldn't just, roll into a Holiday Inn at midnight and hope that there was just a room available. You had to know that they would actually accept your patronage as an African-American person. So the Green Book was a remedy to this dilemma that African-American car travelers experienced as they traveled the highways and byways of North America and beyond. Victor Green solicited information about businesses in various cities, and then he compiled this information that he received in the Green Book. Oasis Spaces, the North Carolina Green Book project was, or still is, it still exists, is a project that was collated by some really wonderful experts at the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. And they've actually created a website there where you can go and take a look at any North Carolina Green Book business that existed in any of the cities in North Carolina. They cataloged all of these businesses, identified the ones that are, the buildings are actually still standing, and even were able to identify a few that are truly still in business. Many Green Book businesses that were listed in the Green Book either no longer exist in terms of being establishments, or, you know, even worse, the buildings are no longer there. So that is the starting point for the North Carolina Green Book project. And hopefully many of you have already gone and taken a look at the traveling exhibit that was created from this research, which is at the Museum of the Albemarle and will be there until the end of this month. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, I strongly encourage you to do so. And then to kind of follow up, you know, let that pique your curiosity, and, you know, get on the internet and find the Oasis Spaces North Carolina Green Book project and learn more about the Green Book establishments that were in your community. So this is just a wonderful image, actually two wonderful images of African-American travelers who, these were migrant workers who came to pick to harvest potatoes during harvest season in Elizabeth City. And we can see them in front of a service station looking at maps and determining their own route to their next their next destination of Delaware. These images are in the Library of Congress, and a few of them are actually even used in that North Carolina Green Book project exhibit in the Museum of the Albemarle. So I think these are just wonderful, and how fortunate are we that this particular photographer, I think his name is Jack Delaney or Jack Delancey, that he was following this group of migrant workers and took these photographs when they were here. So just amazing pieces of the past that really tie this idea of African-American travel and travelers and the necessity of safe routes of passage from Florida all the way to Delaware and back, with a specific stop in Elizabeth City. So I mentioned that there were businesses across the state that were Green Book businesses. There were two that were listed in the Green Book for Elizabeth City in particular. The main one, and this is one that would have been listed just about every year that the Green Book was in existence, was called the Blue Duck Inn. The Blue Duck Inn was owned by a prominent business owner, African-American business owner in Elizabeth City named Henry C. Hargraves. Mr. Hargraves was also a co-owner of the Keystone Barbershop, which still does exist. It was not listed in the Green Book because it did not, it was not a place that African-American people got their hair cut. Instead, in this era of segregation, he was a barbershop owner who catered exclusively to white clientele in his barbershop, which had several locations downtown. Obviously, today's Keystone is now on Shepherd Street, and I assume predominantly has an African-American clientele. But there's an important story right there, and one of the ones that I'm excited to follow up on, of the long story of the Keystone Barbershop, which has been in existence, you know, since the early 1900s in Elizabeth City. But Henry Hargraves co-owned Keystone. He owned the Blue Duck Inn. He also owned a pool hall called Rex Pool Hall, and maybe also a business that I've seen just sort of shadowy references to called Hargraves Beer Garden. So nonetheless, very entrepreneurial individual in town, owned a home on Speed Street that is still here, and owned property on the Outer Banks. So very enterprising individual, and really an important sort of anchor to Elizabeth City's African-American community and to its business community. And I think based on what we're seeing in this advertisement, also an important anchor to the community of people who came to visit Elizabeth City. So visitors would see this advertisement, and they would also see an advertisement for a gas station and garage called Smalls, which at some point was also owned by someone named Overton and was located on Road Street, and that structure is still standing. So we have these two buildings in Elizabeth City. One is the Blue Duck Inn. That structure is no longer standing, but I will share exactly where 404 and a half Earinghouse Street would now be found today. And then a service station, which, you know, for all I know, these individuals could be standing in front of, right, known as Smalls. And that service station is the building that is located now on Road Street and Roanoke, so right on the corner of Road and Roanoke. It's something that many of you, including myself, drive by very frequently, and you may even know the current owners. I'd love to chat with them about the longer history of the building if you do. So in order to dig deeper, I have incorporated my curiosity and my historical interest and my expertise in research into my classes at ECSU. This semester, fall 2021, and also spring of 2021 last semester, I have been working closely with a group of ECSU students in two different classes to identify as many African-American owned businesses from the 1940s era in Elizabeth City as we possibly can, and then to place those businesses and also the homes of the business owners onto a modern map. So it's a mapping project, and it will also, as we move forward, will include additional research into newspapers and census schedules, and hopefully moving from there into interviews and conversation. And the intention in there is to create an archive to enhance the archives at the Museum of the Albemarle and other archives. I feel like, or I believe that as a historian of African-American history, so often I select topics that fascinate me, but I'm very early in my graduate career in particular, I was advised to be really cautious about engaging in projects where the resources and the primary source materials were hard to come by. But I was really fortunate, I think, to start the work that I'm invested in at the cusp of the age of digitization, where historic newspapers and other primary source materials were becoming much more easily accessible and much easier to search, and therefore to create the archive that is necessary to actually conduct research and interpretation to better tell certain kinds of stories. And that, I think, is often the case with African-American history, is that it starts off as archival work, or it starts off as archaeological work and anthropological work in terms of needing to create materials to then interpret, needing to identify and find the source materials to be able to tell the story. And the reason for that is part of a much longer story and history of African-American people and their stories, their histories, even their lived day-to-day lives not being valued as subjects of study by institutions that collect material, institutions that produce scholars, et cetera. So really we're overcoming generations of institutionalized racism that has been directed against African-Americans to be able to tell and capture and recapture particular stories. And it's really urgent that we do this work, and we do it with a determined fashion, because we lose generations of individuals every day, right? And the stories that we want to share are fleeting stories. So it's important to train young people to be able to look at the landscape the same way that I do, have the same kinds of questions about what was here before, before what the landscape looks like today, and to reach out and talk to their community members, to write down stories, to conduct oral history interviews, to talk to people about whether there are materials that they want to preserve and or to donate or have digitized and placed into archives to better tell the story of our community. So that is a lot of the work that I do in the classroom, and especially with this particular project. So you can see here a list of the kinds of materials that we're using in the classroom. So far, we have been using city directories, and I'll explain what those are, and Sanborn Maps. And in the coming weeks, my students and I will start to use the newspapers and census schedules to continue to dive deeper into the stories of some of the individuals that we are learning about and the work that they did in Elizabeth City and their businesses. So just to let you know, city directories are really tricky little beasts. They have they're wonderful resources in terms of genealogy and local history. They have artifacts that help us to identify African American people. There's actually an irony in that the same kinds of institutionalized racism that make it difficult to have source materials that are easily accessible in archives and in museums also make it possible to do the work of creating this kind of archival material. So quickly, because I want to get into some of the heart of what we've been doing. In a city directory, you're going to see markers that indicate African-American people. And in the city's directory for Elizabeth City, that marker is a star. So if you see a star next to a person's name or next to a business, you can have some confidence that that person or that business is African-American or African-American owned business. So here we have in the city directory, just to give you a snapshot of what the city directory business pages look like. And in this case, I'm showing you barbers, of which there were many African-American businesses that were barbershops, and then also furnished rooms, which I explained to my students are basically the Airbnb of 100 years ago, where individuals would rent out rooms in their homes. So both of these are very entrepreneurial kinds of work, and work that serve the community in particular ways. So I mentioned obviously that some of these African-American barbershops did not actually service African-American people, but rather, because it was the era of segregation, they served white clientele. So some of the research that we'll do is to be able to help identify or better identify which of these businesses serviced white clientele and which of them serviced African-Americans. I can tell you, and you'll see on the map that I show a little bit later, that Claude Nelson, who worked at 403 Euclid Avenue, definitely had African-American clientele. And let's see, based on the address, I'm trying to think if there's another I can tell you really easily did as well. Not colonial, not fearing. Maybe on this side of this one, it might, oh yeah, and 404 East Christ. So maybe also William Small. And then on the furnished room side, you can see the furnished rooms that were rented out by African-American women. And that was one of the businesses that African-American women were very much involved in, is renting out rooms in their homes. So just looking, this is a quick snapshot of the Sanborn map. And Sanborn maps come with their own set of challenges, as do actually city directories. And that's that the city that we live in today does not look like the city that existed 100 years ago. In addition to the fact that I've mentioned buildings that no longer are standing, and many of them that are now parking lots, there are also many street names that have changed. And in fact, there are often streets, or there are occasionally streets that did not exist then that exist now, or streets that vice versa existed then that don't exist today. The Museum of the Albemarle provides us with a really good example of many of those things. The museum is really rebuilding, so there were other buildings that were located at right where it is. It sits on Water Street. Water Street at the time was 100 years ago was called Front Street. It also sits on top of, literally on top of a street that no longer exists today called Green Street. So even within the framework of one very large building and piece of property, we can see so many of the different kinds of changes that have taken place in the city. Sanborn Maps, you're looking at one. It's actually not the one from Museum of the Albemarle, but it just gives you a sense of what they look like. They've got lots of symbols and numbers and things, but they also have these clues colored, right? If you see right there with the Elks Hall in the center, that it says colored. So that helps us to at least get a starting point for orienting ourselves. This is in the middle of the Shepherd Street neighborhood, and it's an important establishment in terms of community gathering within this space. So another street, I mentioned streets that have different names. This is Euclid Avenue, which is today Martin Street. Particularly between Shepherd Street and Airing House, and then crossing Airing House, going over towards Grice, that is Euclid Avenue, or that's Martin Street today, but it was Euclid Avenue at the time. And again, we see the term colored under dance hall. And that again is an indicator that this is an African-American neighborhood. So these are just little snapshots that are coming out of the Sanborn map. So this again just kind of explains the things that I've been describing, that names change, configurations change, buildings are demolished. I mean, my goodness, there was a railroad that went through Elizabeth City that there's no sign of anymore, right? Where Grice Street was, that was called Canal Street. There was a canal and the railroad, and none of those things are there anymore. So the landscape has changed dramatically. And that has proved to be very interesting to my students, and certainly interesting, creating new challenges for each of us as I strive to teach them and learn at the same time. And they strive to kind of make sense of these changes in the urban landscape. In the next coming weeks, we'll start to look at newspapers in particular. We've just started to select a couple of African-American owned businesses that each student will focus on, going from a large number to a small number. And we'll be primarily using an African-American newspaper called the New Journal and Guide, or the Norfolk Journal and Guide, which had a column in it every week that featured news from Elizabeth City. It becomes a hunt and peck kind of research project for my students. It'll be a very new experience to have to look for, very particular kinds of keywords, people's names, the different ways that people may have spelled their names, the different ways that they may refer to themselves, sometimes by their full name, sometimes by initials, the names of their businesses, et cetera. So doing all that kind of very minutia research to be able to identify things like you see right here, advertisements of African-American businesses, or articles that reference African-American businesses. So you've seen in this case some real estate businesses, and now also some funeral directors. And those obviously, in addition to the ones that I've mentioned, are some of the variety of African-American businesses that there were in Elizabeth City. The work that we've done so far is to create this incredible database of African-American owned businesses. And you see some of the students' names on the extreme left, in part because every student who works with me will be getting some kind of credit in terms of whatever this turns out to be, whether it's a museum exhibit or whether it's a publication. Their work is being recorded because they have contributed to this project. And it's a project that will take multiple years. So this is just a snapshot. We've actually found about 75 different African-American owned businesses and business owners in this 1942 Elizabeth City directory. So I think that's a sizable number. And if we think about both the places of work and then also their homes, which I'm tracking too, we're going to see a very different landscape unfold as we start to identify where these places were on a map. And so this is just another snapshot, and I won't focus on it too much because I've already shown you, but this is, the next couple of maps that I show you are going to show you these African-American businesses. So wherever you see a blue dot, these are some African-American owned businesses that were in a particular square of Elizabeth City, say. So these different sections of the city directory represent Erringhouse Street to Road Street, the intersection or the corner of Erringhouse and Road, then Road to Shepherd, and then Shepherd to Euclid, which again is now Martin, or rather it's now McMorran, and then Erringhouse again. So if you were driving down, sort of driving around a square from CVS all the way to where the cemetery is, that fronts the museum, and back. So that's sort of that square. And this is important to me just because it really represents the density of African-American businesses that you can find at any given place, and also some fixtures that remain in our community. So many of you know or about, or maybe are even attendees of or members of Cornerstone Missionary Baptist Church, which is in this little square that I'm referring to. The Blue Duck Inn was in this square, and that building is no longer standing, but it's a really important building for us to think about, or the location is a really important one for us to think about in terms of these changes. So here is a visual representation on a contemporary map of some of that area that I'm talking about. So if you're driving down today, you're going to see the Quality Seafood, you're going to see a gas station, you're going to see the Museum of the Albemarle, several different kinds of businesses. I'm going to, and hopefully you can see this with my my little arrow here. This building is a vacant building that some of you may remember as a Piggly Wiggly supermarket from many, many years ago. And that information as a newcomer is actually really interesting to me. I didn't know what this building was. I just knew it as a vacant building. On this site, decades before Piggly Wiggly, this is where the Blue Duck Inn was located. Mm. And around the corner from the Blue Duck Inn, this street would have been called Canal Street, which is now East Grace. This is where the railroad tracks ran through the city. And in this parking lot, and I can't wait to show you a picture of the parking lot today, but in this parking lot were 3 businesses, African-American businesses, 2 restaurants and a barbershop. And then along this road, along Erringhouse Road on the other side, were several African-American owned businesses. And then going down this street, which is now South McMorran, then was Euclid. There were more. This is where Lamb's Dance Hall was. And, continuing down onto Shepherd Street, it's where the Gaiety Theater is. So that is, we're talking about a density of African-American owned businesses here. And this is a map from 1930. So this is a Sanborn map that I've stitched together roughly from 1930. And it just reinforces all the things that I've said. The Blue Duck Inn was located here. This is now, this little square is where that empty building that was a Piggly Wiggly was, right? The Rex pool hall was here. There was a shoe repair shop here, Harvey Chapman's Shoe Repair, and the Blue Duck Inn. And then over here were the 3 businesses right by the railroad, the 2 lunchrooms and a barber shop. This was another pool hall called 4-Way. This was Laura Lowry's dress shop. This was another lunchroom. And here is the Lamb's Dance Hall and also a candy shop. These were owned by J.T. Lamb, I think Joseph T. Lamb. Here is another African-American restaurant. Here is the Gaiety Theater. Here, Hoffler's doctor's office, the 2 brother Hofflers. And then this, I believe, this was a dental office and is now a piece of property owned by Cornerstone. So I'm really excited to talk to folks from Cornerstone who know some of their property history and have maybe records. This building is not in active use, but is owned by Cornerstone and was a home that was also had a dental office right here. So this little pop out right here, if you were to drive by the house today, you'll see a main entryway and then a side entryway that was where the office was. Here's Cornerstone, just for place of reference to kind of orient yourself in terms of thinking about today's map. And this area here is actually, if you look at the modern map, I think we can even see it on the modern map. There are several businesses where it says right here, where it says Cornerstone, the map's wrong. I don't know why it says it there, but there's a couple of businesses, but I think that Cornerstone owns the property where those businesses are. There's a beauty salon, there's a coffee shop, that kind of thing. But that's where Lamb's Confectionery and Dance Hall were. So that's the kind of work we are doing actively in the course. I'm happy to stop right here. So we've got about 10 minutes left for questions and conversation. It's a works in progress. And in fact, I just thought about something I'd like to share. I'm going to share something different with you guys, just to give you a sense of what it is, what it looks like from the perspective of working in the classroom or working on the actual maps.
Okay. Well, for those virtually and for those here in person, while Dr. Melissa is working to get that connection, feel free to answer in the chat. Put in your questions, please, and we'll read them off and have Ms. Stuckey answer any questions y'all may have. Any questions from those in public? All right, we do have one.
I'd love to hear it.
Go again, ma'am. Okay.
I didn't realize about this until today, but I would like to make a link with the faculty or whoever's in charge with this, because there's some things that maybe we can help with. Like, for example, when we talked about Dr. Cook's office, the dentist, his wife was a piano music teacher, and most of the people that took music also went there. And he probably taught about 90% of piano students and organ students. So it's just little things that possibly we can also help with. There was a Shannon Grocery off of Shepherd Street near where the Gator Theater is. Also in Southern Avenue. And I don't know if that's included in this project or not, but there were numerous Black businesses on Southern Avenue as well. So we just want to know how we can possibly get involved.
Okay.
And see what we can possibly do as well.
All right, I'll reiterate that for you. All right, Ms. Stuckey, we have one question from the public. Some of the members in the public are wondering, how do community team members, how can they help you and your students with the research? Is there a way for them to connect via a location online, or how do they get in contact with you in order to get some help?
First of all, thank you so much. That fills, because project, it can be skeletoned out by us, but in the classroom. But my desire and my intention is for it to bring forth memories like what you just expressed, and for us to, whether it's do oral history projects or, you know, sit down with maps and some names and take notes. So, and, you know, maybe you have pictures of you with the piano, you know, like things like that are just so so important to me and to my students, but more important to you and your community, that we are able to pull our story, pull all of these community stories and memories together to tell a comprehensive story of Elizabeth City's African-American community. So I will put, for starters, I will put and invite you to read out my email address at Elizabeth City State University. You can find me there easily. But I think that it's also important that we kind of think, a little bit bigger about how to get together in small groups, maybe eat at, meeting rooms at the museum, or meeting rooms at ECSU, or meeting rooms at the library, together, so that we can just pour over these things together and have conversation. So there's nothing formal right now, but the intention of doing this presentation and to continue to do this presentation are to start that process. So, maybe you invite me to your church, right? Invite me to your club, and I can do this presentation or do a shorter version of it. And we can spend an evening or an afternoon talking. You can do that in person. We can do that via Zoom. Let's just keep the conversation going. So find me, I'm easily accessible. Again, I'll put my email address in the chat, but also I'll say it out loud. It's M as in Melissa, N as in Nicole, Stuckey, STUCKEY at ecsu.edu.
Any questions from those virtually or again in person?
So while we're waiting on additional questions, I will just show you one of the sort of the results of the work is me mapping all of this stuff that I'm learning onto Google Earth. So this is essentially a Google Earth walking tour. And it's really right now an internal document, but it really provides a nice visualization of what it would be like to walk through this neighborhood, knowing what homes and businesses were here. So it starts off at the moment with the home of Isabella Smith, who was a private nurse who lived at 105 East Airing House. And I'm sure that you all can recognize where this location is. The CVS is where this red sign is. So this is right across the street where there are a couple of commercial buildings that are probably vacant right now. So just walking from her house to very next door, we have the home of George L. White, who was the co-owner of Keithship Barbershop, and he lived on 109 East Airing House. And again, you're seeing that this, the repetition of the idea that either the buildings are no longer there or the spaces are empty. And again, this is where the Piggly Wiggly was. I'm glad I can at least say that now that I know what that empty building is. And this was 400 to 404 and a half or so East Airing House. This is where the Blue Duck Inn was located, and several businesses were also there as well. So as I mentioned, Harvey Chapman's shoe repair shop was one of the buildings or one of the businesses in that Blue Duck Inn building. And then the Blue Duck Inn itself would be represented by this particular space. And then crossing the street, we have empty lot right across the street from the seafood store. And we've got, on this particular corner was a lunchroom. And then next door to that was, I think this is Miss Laurie's dress shop in her home. And then next door to that on the corner was Four-Way Pool Parlor, which is now on McMorran, but at the time was Euclid. And then just continuing on down this road, the landscape changes so dramatically that this is actually where those businesses that I believe are owned by Cornerstone Missionary Baptist are now located. But at the time when Google Maps was here taking pictures, it was an empty lot. And this empty lot is where Lamb's Dance Hall and Lamb's Confectionery had stood. I'd love to know what that sign had said at the time, whether it was Lamb's or something else. So again, this would be the confectionery. And then Commodore McLeese owned a fish market on Market Street. And then we get to the Gaiety Theater. So the map project that I'm working on will just continue to do exactly this. I've got, as you can see, there are 75 entries in it right now. We're continuing to add more to it, but also just working on making sure that it's as easy to move along the street as it is right now. So you can imagine that there's a business, you just kind of want to make it easy to walk down the streets and around the streets. And that's going to be kind of tricky to do. This was a Black woman's business on this corner here where this empty lot is, called Try Me Beauty Parlor. I love that name. And then Ms. Whitehurst, who owned Try Me, lived in a multifamily home that was here. That is no longer standing. And also living here were Dr. Cardwell and Mrs. Cardwell. So you can see we're just kind of plotting or just kind of placing each home and business along where it belongs. I won't go any further because I think after this it probably jumps to a different part of town or just a different street entirely. But you know, we're just kind of working step by step by step to give us a really kind of logical walking tour through town. I'm happy to take other questions.
Any more questions or curiosities? Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions. Oh, we do actually. Okay. Okay. To reiterate the question was, have any historic locations been found near or close to Elizabeth City State University?
So ECSU in and of itself is a historic location. And yes, there are definitely businesses that were near it and also homes and business owners that were near it. ECSU, its modern location was right outside of town. So it was kind of if you were thinking about a neighborhood growing, the neighborhood was growing towards the modern university. But many of you also know that there were other buildings in Elizabeth City that were within the Shepherd Street neighborhood where ECSU, which was then the normal school, rented in order to, before they owned their own property. So those are certainly, first of all, embedded within this neighborhood that we're looking at and have businesses all around them as well and homes.
Okay, and we did have another question from the gentleman in the back. Yes. Okay. All right. Any others? Nope.
Oh, there's a hand raised over here. Frank Johnson, if you want to unmute yourself, you can.
Yeah, I grew up in Elizabeth City and I kind of moved out in the 70s. And I remember some of those businesses in Shepherd Street area. Mm-hmm. But I'm just one, I had no idea there was that many businesses, like home businesses in Elizabeth City. And I'm kind of curious, just what happened to, it wasn't carried on or just generational stuff, or it just seems like there are no businesses there now. Very few.
Yeah, well, yeah, I love that question. It was one of the when I think about my students' reaction to the work that they did this spring in particular, one of the things that stands out most to me is a brilliant young woman who expressed frustration that so many of the businesses and homes that she was assigned, and they were all assigned them very randomly, were empty lots, right? Like, why is it? Why are we looking at so many empty lots instead of homes that are preserved and business buildings that are preserved? And it's a long story. It's a complicated story. It's a story that's about the end of segregation. It's a story that's about the beginning of urban renewal and how those things are interlinked in ways that have to be spoken about. And what I mean by that is that street widenings and modernization and anti-slum and all of these kinds of things had a profound impact on African-American structures, owned structures. You don't get a CVS or a Firehouse Subway restaurant or, you know, all of these modern businesses, chain stores, et cetera, on Ehringhaus without tear down, right? And much of that tear down were buildings, homes, businesses that were owned by African-American people. Now, why were they so vulnerable to that? Now, I'm speaking very broadly here rather than the specific Elizabeth City story, which is one that is to be researched, right? So ... But speaking very broadly, it's about migration patterns to some extent, right? And it's also about of vulnerability because of being left out of the political system or pushed out of the political system for so long. So having, not having as many advocates, right? And financial base to advocate for oneself. One of the things that we've speculated in class, so thinking very specifically about Elizabeth City, and I think that we're starting to see a little bit of evidence of, is that some of these business owners were very successful and were able to send their kids out of state to go to college, right? So if you can send a kid to Philadelphia to go to college, or even to Meharry to go to medical school in Tennessee, or to Virginia to go to college, they did that. And their children then established themselves in those new communities and sometimes did not come back. And then over generations, you know, the well of money isn't necessarily deep enough to maintain property in your new home with your new family and in raising your children, and also to maintain the property that your parents had when they passed away, or maybe some of these people didn't have children at all. So there are lots of reasons why property ends up, you know, not being maintained in terms of taxes, and then it ends up being owned by the city. And I think that a lot of the properties that we're looking at are city-owned properties, a lot of these vacant spaces. So there's a combination of things happening. One of the things that I wanted to show, going back to the map, that really kind of speaks to the urban renewal issue in particular, is we're moving now back to Euclid / McMorran, where the Blue Duck Inn was located. So crossing that street. Now I'm just going to kind of move us down, see if I can do this. I love Google Maps and Google Earth for exactly this, right? So we're just kind of driving down the street. Now we're at that parking lot where the Piggly Wiggly was, right? And if we turn down to the street, a little awkward, there we go. We can start to see, can get us over here, there we go. What I think is really fascinating. And this again is where I mentioned that there were 3 African-American owned businesses in this parking lot. And I think that if you were to zoom in a little bit, maybe not from this particular angle, there we go. You start to see a little bit of the foundation, right? This parking lot is not perfectly smooth. And there's no particular reason why it should not be perfectly smooth, except for the fact that there were things that were standing here before it was a parking lot. So I think about this as almost like the scars, the remnants that say that there was something here before this was paved over. There was something here before there was a parking lot. And in this case, there was 3 African-American owned businesses where there is now, you know, basically, you know, a not very pretty landscape of kind of broken pavement. But that says to me that, you know, our past is still there and it's almost crying out to be remembered and for us to insist that a story is being told. So I'm really grateful to be here in Elizabeth City and to have the skills and the tools and the interest to start to do this, and excited to connect with folks like the ones that are here, in person or on the call to tell these stories, right? Like, them, they're in your hearts, they're in your heads, they're in your memories, they're in your photo albums. And I want them to ensure that that they live beyond us. We're only here for a small amount of time, but hopefully we can create spaces and materials and publications and exhibits and spaces for those materials to be saved and preserved and cared for, so that the stories of who you were, the stories of who we were and who we are available for future generations, because of that generational thing that we just talked about, folks moving away, folks coming and not coming back. It's hard to sometimes look at your own particular life and the day-to-day and all the little bits and pieces that go into it and think, oh, there's some real historic value there. There may be sentimental value, or there may not be, sometimes depending on, your burdens. Sometimes caring for the past feels very heavy and burdensome. You've got so much to do in the present, but hopefully together we can find spaces to steward the past and ensure that institutions like the Museum of the Albemarle, like ECSU, like the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission and the state museums, all are doing the work, taxpayer funded work to be the stewards of the African American past of Elizabeth City and of other places, like they should.
Right. That was definitely a great question for sure. Do we have any last minute questions from either groups?
Frank's got his hand up again. I don't know if it's on purpose or not this time.
All right. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Okay, thank you very much for answering that. It's just one more thing, and this is something that's difficult. Like I told you before, I grew up there, and mostly probably my teenage years were probably the 60s or the 70s. This is something I've always had a hard time processing. I knew that growing up in certain parts of the South, there was some really bad things going on. I've asked some people that were my older relatives, which are not here anymore, is what was Elizabeth City like at that time? I know there were legal stuff, segregation, but it wasn't the violence and the oppression that sometimes I saw on the TV happen in other parts of the South. Did that ever take place in Elizabeth City? I can't quite get a clear answer on that. Well, what was it like? I don't, because it's like you were there, but at the same time, you can't really process what was going on around you.
Yeah, I think that is such an important question. And I love the way that you reflected on and framing it. I'm having a similar kind of feeling about a city that I grew up in, or several cities that I grew up in. When you're living in a moment, you're living, right? And unless there is a huge something that happens that kind of rips the fabric, it may not feel as clear about, what the big picture is, the stepping back picture. And that's a lot of what historians do, is that we kind of look at all the small things and then kind of step back and try to figure out, what does the aggregate mean? What is happening here? So to some extent, I can't fairly give you that assessment, right? And I can't fairly give you that assessment because I'm actively doing a portion of research. And to my knowledge, there is no grand assessment of Elizabeth City in terms of African-American history in existence yet. The work that I'm doing contributes to the possibility of something like that existing. What I can say is that having looked in the archive, there are some things that are abundantly clear. Clearly, goes without saying that Elizabeth City was a city that subscribed to segregation. There were moments of unrest and incidences of discrimination, incidences of violence towards African Americans. But no, I have not seen any epical moments of unrest in the archive that would compare it to something like a bigger city, say if you were to compare it to Birmingham, Alabama. I haven't seen anything like that. Nonetheless, it's what stands out to me is what I share with you, right? Is that we see a landscape that's denuded of a particular kind of wealth and material success that had been there at a moment. And I started this off by talking about my drive to work every day and the questions that I have based on that drive of why is the landscape different, so vastly different today than it was 100 years ago? How did we get there? And it's my hope, Mr. Johnson, and others on the call, that we start to figure out the answers to those questions together by starting with asking them, starting with piecing together what we do know through the archive, but also really, really importantly, through personal memory. There are things that are not going to be in the archive. There are important stories related to African-American people whose perspectives are not going to be prioritized in the quote unquote archive. So we all who care take on the responsibility of doing the work to be able to start to answer your question. And we do that just by collecting and preserving memories. So whatever memories you have, good, bad, indifferent, just being able to say, I lived on this block, standing at that block and looking around and saying, I remember who lived next door to me. I remember the grocer. I remember the piano teacher. All of those memories profoundly matter for us to be able to tell this larger story that we are seeking actively together to figure out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. That was very good.
So again, anyone who wants to contact me, I'm going to put my email address in the chat right now, but you can find me at ECSU. You can see my name here, so it'll be easy to find me that way. And folks are starting to figure out who I am around town, so it won't be too hard to find me.
That's her email address in case anybody wants to write it down. It's on the screen for those in public. To kind of also add into Dr. Stuckey's commentary in the very last part with Mr. Johnson's question, which was amazing. We do also here at the Museum of the Albemarle have similar options for those interested in serving the community and passing down history that you all lived through in order for our younger generations to learn from those who've been here before. We at the museum do have an active program for volunteering that we would love to offer for you all. If you are here in person, we do have applications right there in the back. As you come out, there's a little side table back there. We would love for you to get in touch with us. We do have opportunities for education as well as research opportunities for history and other materials. So we would love to have your engagement with us in order for us to continue passing down history and lessons to our future generations. Any last detailed questions or anything like that before we wrap up? Just in case those who joined us late in the lecture, we're just doing a reminder for our next topic of History for Lunch. That is scheduled for Wednesday, November 3rd at 12 p.m. And this is with Rear Admiral Carlton Moore joining us virtually all the way from California to discuss a daring rescue that on December 17, 2000, the Coast Guard Air Station, Elizabeth City, North Carolina, responded to a call for help. The cruise ship Sea Breeze 1 was listing battered by hurricane force winds and 35-foot seas. The ship and the lives of its 34 crewmen were in imminent peril. A rescue helicopter arrived, and seeing that the vessel could capsize at any moment, hoisted 26 of the crew to safety, a record for a single helicopter rescue. A second helicopter was designed for the celebration of the Wright brothers' first flight, arrived on scene in time to rescue that remaining crew. Again, that's for those who attended late. That is scheduled for November 3rd at Wednesday, 12 p.m. Dr. Stuckey, it was a pleasure to have you again with us, as always. And hopefully next time around, it'll probably be Lori hosting again, unless she asks me to join in for her again. But it was a pleasure on my end to work with you.
Thank you so much. I hope that I started to generate ideas for you, because I'm excited to keep the work going.
Likewise for us here at the museum. All right, thank you everyone for those of you who were here in person, and we hope to see you again. Do please stop by the second floor exhibition before we close up the Oasis Spaces. Bye, Dr. Stuckey.
Bye, everybody.